Good morning, Nigeria. A beautiful week to you. I am Cassie Tony, and I'll be taking you through the segment of newspaper review. First, we'll start with the New Telegraph, boldly written on page 3, 5, 14 to 16. Admissions outside JAM illegal. Minimum entry age still 16 years coming from federal government. At the top of the newspaper, single window falters as 750 billion naira worth of cargoes trapped coming from port reforms. You get that on page 3 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, on the foreign scene, Middle East crisis, oil price hits $105.99 per barrel. You get that on page 7 of the newspaper. Tinubu in Nairobi for multilateral discussions with fellow African nations. You get it on page 2 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, on page 3, coming from Amopitan, I'll mobilize 1.4 million core members for 2027 polls. Still in the same newspaper, on page 4, ASO threatens fresh strike over unimplemented 2025 pact. Still on the foreign scene, ceasefire on live support as Iran's standoff deepened. Strait remains doors. You get that on page 4 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, on page 4, 2027, court hears fresh applications in suit seeking to deregister ADC, Accord, and others. In the same newspaper, on page 29, bandit killed 30 travelers in Zamfara highway ambush. On page 2 of the newspaper, xenophobia. Federal government warns Nigerians as South Africa begins crackdown on illegal immigrants. Then on page 4 of the newspaper as well, French, American passengers test positive for hantavirus after cruise ship evacuation. Moving away from that newspaper to the Matrix, boldly written on page 2 of the newspaper, JAM retains 150 as cutoff mark. JAM retained 150 as cutoff mark. At the top of the newspaper, FEC approves NRIDF to drive Nigeria's innovation agenda. You get that on page 3 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, on page 3 as well, 2027, why I accepted to be Peter Obi's running mate, Kwankwaso opens up. Then on page 3 of the newspaper, on politics, Tinubu names retired General Famadewa Homeland Security Advisor. On page 2 of the newspaper as well, INEC to deploy 1.4 million corps members for 2027 polls. On page 3 of the newspaper, alleged unlawful Naira redesign, court admits more exhibits against Emefiele. Moving away from that newspaper to the Daily Trust, boldly written on page 3 of the newspaper. This is a question that Nigerians are asking. Is Tinubu changing security architecture? On top of the newspaper, on page 7, 16-year-old Daniela Owoye emerges 2026 UTME highest scorer. Wow. Then on page 7 of the newspaper as well, another judge orders arrest of ex-minister Saleh Maman. Still in the same newspaper, on page 20, 500 naira pepper tomatoes disappear from market as price skyrocket. On page 4 of the newspaper, 11th Senate, why Uzodinma is throwing his hat into the ring. Still in the same newspaper, at the bottom, fishermen feared killed after Chad airstrikes on Boko Haram. Then on page 5 of the newspaper, alleged coup. Again, families of suspect protest in Abuja. On page 7 of the newspaper as well, ex-Jigawa rep dies in bandits' den. Colleague freed after 50 million ransom. Away from that newspaper to the Daily Sun, boldly written on page 6, rules for 11th Assembly Senate sets 14-day deadline for senators elect to be sworn in. At the top of the newspaper on page 29, Anambra begins crackdown on suspected fake pastors. Still in the same newspaper on page 25, banks withdraw 1.76 trillion naira from CBN, keep more cash ahead of elections. At the bottom of the newspaper on page 26, malpractice, WAEC unveils tough measures for 1.9 million candidates. Still in the same newspaper on page 8, PGF crisis, forum demands Tinubu's intervention. Then on page 6 and page 26 of the newspaper, federal government okays 150 minimum admission score for varsities, nursing colleges. On page 26 of the newspaper, Uzodinma say federal government reforms reason economy thriving despite US-Iran war, global crisis. Uzodinma says federal government reforms is the reason economy is thriving despite US-Iran war, global crisis. Moving away from that newspaper to the leadership. Boldly written on page 4 of the newspaper, I will gladly serve as Obi's running mate, coming from Kwankwaso. Then on page 26 of the newspaper, ACF crisis, we won't bow to external manipulation, NEC tells BOT. At the top of the newspaper on page 4, anger, alienation, distrust drive British politics, says Nigerian who recently contested councillorship in UK. Anger, alienation, distrust drive British politics, says Nigerian who recently contested councillorship in UK. You get that on page 4 of the newspaper. INEC to deploy 1.4 million core members for 2027 polls. You get that on page 7 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper on page 19, ASU threatens strike over federal government's plan to scrap irrelevant courses across varsities. On page 9 of the newspaper, in move to strengthen fight against insecurity, Tinubu names retired General Famadewa Homeland Security Advisor. You get that on page 9 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper on page 7, we can raise 10 million naira ransom for 11 adopted victims. Kaduna community cries out. On page 8 of the newspaper, federal government sets 150 cutoff marks for varsities, polytechnics, excludes College of Education from UTME. Still in the same newspaper on page 6 at the bottom, bandits kill 30 travelers in Zamfara highway ambush. Away from that newspaper to the Nigerian Tribune. Boldly written, Rivers, fate of Fubara's men hangs in the balance. You get the full gist on page 14 of the newspaper. Then at the top of the newspaper, I warned them the coup against Tinubu will fail, coming from Islamic cleric. You get it on page 30 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, ACF orders forensic audit over alleged 1.4 billion naira endorsement fund transfers. You get that on page 30 of the newspaper. Moving away from that newspaper to the Vanguard. Boldly written, 2027 presidency, Jonathan caught in PDP's Kwame. You get that on page 5 of the newspaper. At the top of the newspaper, NESG raises fresh concern over Nigeria's debt burden. You get that on page 19 of the newspaper. 2027, Wike, Fubara's rivalry deepens. You get that on page 28 of the newspaper. On page 26 of the newspaper as well, Atiku kicks against Southern presidency, warns opposition against self-defectist politics. On page 7 of the newspaper, 42 killed in Zamfara, Benue, attacks, many adopted. Tinubu appoints Homeland Security Advisor to strengthen internal security. You get that on page 9 of the newspaper. FNPP alerts Tinubu of plot to destabilize PGF ahead of 2027. You get the full gist on page 4 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the blueprint, boldly written. Uzodinma says state governments now receive monthly net income of 800 billion naira. You get that on page 8 of the newspaper. At the top of the newspaper on page 7, we suspected BOT chair over the diversion of funds coming from NEC. Still in the same newspaper, Lagos plans own driver's license, records 737,340 traffic infraction in 1 year. Lagos plans own driver's license, records 737,340 traffic infraction in 1 year. You get the full gist on page 8 of the newspaper. Court orders trial within trial as core plot suspect deny written statement. You get that on page 8 of the newspaper as well. Still in the same newspaper at the bottom, first flight left Sokoto with 485 intending pilgrims. You get that on page 19 of the newspaper. CBN FRACE depends governance framework for non-interest financial institute. CBN phrase deepened governance framework for non-interest financial institutions. You get that on page 20 of the newspaper. Moving away from that newspaper to the Guardian, boldly written, the factors face dual party registration sanctions, await INEC's verdict. You get that on page 6 of the newspaper. Court to hear suits seeking the registration of ADC, Accord, and others. Then on page 5 of the newspaper as well, threatens showdown with federal government over 2025 agreement implementation. You get it on page 5 of the newspaper. Nigeria imports 1.8 billion liters of petrol as FX stability softens prices. You get that on page 3 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, Ramaphosa condemns xenophobic violence, vows crackdown on illegal immigration. You get that on page 5 of the newspaper. APC battles widen cracks over candidate selection ahead of 2027. You get that on page 6 of the newspaper. Fubara Wike's rift deepens as APC rejects 32 government-backed aspirants. You get that on page 8 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Daily Independent, boldly written, cost of living crisis hollows out Nigeria's insurance sector. You get that on page 23 of the newspaper. At the top of the newspaper on page 4, Nigeria, European Union, World Health Organization scale up response to 4 major disease outbreak. You get that on page 7 of the newspaper. Fresh crisis looms as ASU accuses federal government of breaching 2025 pact. Together on page 5 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper at the bottom, Adeleke disposes Osun monarch sentenced to prison in US. You get that on page 6 of the newspaper. APC denies disqualifying Fubara loyalists for Rivers Assembly. You get that on page 6 of the newspaper. Nigeria's headline indicators stabilize, but fiscal pressure persists. You get that on page 6 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the First Daily, boldly written, Wike calm tightens grip as Fubara walks out. At the top of the newspaper, federal government orders nationwide drug test for SS students. Still in the same newspaper, INEC begins final phase of voter registration exercise. Federal government retains 16-year minimum age for university admission. Still in the same newspaper, ex-lawmaker dies in captivity after ransom payment. Ex-lawmaker dies in captivity after ransom payment. 2027, court adjourns suit challenging Jonathan's eligibility. Still in the same newspaper, Keyamo slams NDC zoning plan as political 419. Moving away from that newspaper to The Nation, boldly written, Atiku attacks NDC over zoning of presidential ticket to South. At the top of the newspaper, Makinde, now a member, says APM BOT chairman. You get it on page 3 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, Adeleke dethrones Osun monarch jail for COVID-19 fraud in US. You get that on page 33 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, Tinubu in Kenya for France Africa Economic Cooperation meeting. You get that on page 2 of the newspaper. There's plot to destabilize PGF ahead of 2027 elections. You get the full gist on page 2 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Daily Monitor, boldly written, NDC, why northern politicians accepted zoning 2027 presidency to South, coming from Kwankwaso. At the top of the newspaper, 2027, eligibility suit against ex-president Jonathan suffers setback. You get the full gist on page 2 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, NASU resume negotiation with federal government after strike suspension. You get the full gist on page 2 of the newspaper. Then on the foreign scene, alleged $9.6 billion PNID scam. Court convicts fleeing Britain in absentia. You get that on page 5 of the newspaper. Court convicts fleeing Britain in absentia. You get that on page 5 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, ASU warns of poor implementation of 2005 agreement. You get the full gist on page 2 of the newspaper. We've come to the end of the newspaper review. Many thanks for watching. I am Cassie Tony, and do well to join us next time for more breaking news. Do have a beautiful day.